everyone. Welcome to Sudo for Solidarity's first workshop in our two-part series, Until We're All Free, Skills for Abolitionist Organizing. And this is part one, Narrative, Communication, and Conversation. And so my name is Casey Mukai. I use the she, her series, and I am one of the co-organizers of this event. And I would now like to invite my other wonderful co-organizers to introduce themselves, starting with Carl.
Hey, Carl Takei. I use he, him pronouns, and really glad to be here. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Police Prison Detention Working Group along with Alexis. I'll popcorn it over to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Lauren Sumida. I use she, they pronouns. I'm also part of the Police Prisons and Detention Working Group with Sudo for Solidarity. And I'll pass to Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve. I'm an undergrad at Cal, and I'm part of the Police Prisons and Detention Working Group. I'll pass it to Lisa.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa. I use she, her pronouns, also on the Police Prisons Detention Working Group. And I think that's it. Is that correct, Casey?
Yep. That's right. Thanks, everyone. So yes, just a reminder that we are recording this, but we are only recording the presentation part of this workshop so that those who did not make it can be able to watch it on our YouTube channel later. Next slide, please. So a little bit back to the community agreements. There we go. So we would also like to just share some community agreements to guide our workshop today, as we are going to be diving deep and doing some breakout rooms. So first, take space, make space, collaborative learning, take care of ourselves to take care of each other, practice tenderness and confidentiality. And so feel free to put any more in our chat that you might need today to feel comfortable and affirmed while we learn and grow together. Next slide. Wonderful. So our workshop is broken up into 3 parts, and we'll be diving deep into the next parts. But just know that we will be going for 2.5 hours, which we know is a big chunk of time. So feel free to take a break at any time, or stretch or step away from your computer if you need to. Next slide. So for those of you that are new with us here today, welcome. Sudo for Solidarity is a direct action project of advocates working to end all detention sites and support communities that have experienced forced removal, detention, deportation, separation of families, and other forms of racial and state violence. To give some background to this workshop, this series arose out of a desire to deepen our skills and knowledge in abolition work, specifically in the context of how it takes shape within Sudo and our Japanese American community. So the first part of the series, the one that you are currently attending, Narrative, Communication, and Conversation, looks into how we come to understand our own stories and identities, as well as how we understand the larger narratives in the world, both good and bad. The second part of our series, which will be taking place next Saturday at the same time, will dive into action and arts and the importance of activism to telling stories. We will be inviting representatives from guest organizations to share about their work, so we hope that you will be able to join us next week. Next slide. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So next slide, please. First, we want to define what a narrative is, right? So narratives are stories and are the way that you and I conceptualize the world around us. On an individual level or personal level, it's the way that we might be able to recall or retell our lives, our own memories, relationships, and our identities. However, on a larger scale, narratives and stories are the way we understand social movements around us, and in this context, abolition. Some examples of narratives that we may use to make sense of the world include how we might conceptualize the US as a nation, as this land of the free, or how we might tell history, always the necessity for the story to have a good and a bad side, or how mass social movements take shape in the world, and how we tell our stories of resistance and collective planning. So whether unconscious or conscious, everybody here believes in certain stories that make us who we are and how we see the world. Next slide. So now, why is any of this important, and more specifically important to abolition work? Well, these stories are very powerful, as stories can bring people together, but can also divide us. The decisions that we make in life are based on the roles that we believe we must play in these larger stories. And we know that people are willing to stand up for and fight for certain narratives. So it's extremely important that we understand how these narratives work and make sure they are aligned with our own personal values. A key part to abolition organizing is realizing and recognizing each of our own realities and understanding that stories help bring us together towards improving and enhancing a better place to exist in this world free from all forms of violence. Sudo as an organization believes in drawing a message of solidarity from our narratives. This all seems very abstract, I know, so as we move on in this workshop, we'll be sure to contextualize that for you. And with that, I'll now pass it to Steve.
Thanks, Casey. Maybe go to the next slide, please. So just to make things more concrete for y'all, we're going to talk about a few examples of social narratives and what they look like in the wild, as it were. Because Tsuda is a Japanese American organization, we're going to be focusing on some myths around Japanese Americanness as a case study. So here we have this myth that was pretty commonly accepted up through World War II, which is the idea of Japanese American immigrants as a fifth column. So fifth column, for y'all that don't know, is it's a group of people within a country that in times of war actively act to subvert and sabotage that country. And so this was something that was like so widely believed about Japanese Americans that it almost felt like common sense for a lot of people who weren't Japanese Americans that, you know, of course, a Japanese American is going to be loyal to the Japanese emperor. You know, of course, they're not going to be having America's best interests at heart, which, you know, is obviously all false. But this was like the mainstream story, the mainstream narrative that people believed. So mainstream, in fact, that this racist political cartoon in the front, that was drawn by Dr. Seuss, I believe. And so this is an example of a narrative, right? And you can see the us versus them binary in this, where you have Japanese people or Japanese American people positioned as a them, and everybody else in America positioned as an us. You can also see how myths have power, right? So people buying into this narrative, a narrative that was propagated by the government, propagated by newspapers, propagated just from person to person. It helped facilitate Japanese American incarceration during World War II. You know, we got to see Japanese American incarceration not as like this isolated tragedy. It's like, it's not that everybody in 1942 was like a horrible person in America. It's because even the people who are ostensibly on the side of liberty, like the ACLU, didn't really speak up because they bought into this story. And that's why even if we see ourselves as like progressive or open-minded, we got to be careful that we don't also have these kind of us versus them binaries that kind of sneak into our consciousness. So next slide, please. And by the 80s, things had kind of turned around for how Japanese Americans were perceived. You had this idea of the model minority, which I'm sure y'all are familiar with. Japanese Americans and Asian Americans more broadly were sort of invited into the us camp, you know, to some extent. The idea of the model minority seems nice, right? Because it's like ostensibly like a positive thing. But when you look at who's left in the them camp, you know, it's other minorities in the US. Because when we say that Asian Americans are successful because they work harder, because they have more focus on academia or whatever, we're implicitly saying that other minorities, you know, they're still struggling because they deserve it, because they didn't work hard enough. And that's like a really nasty implication. And just because this myth puts us in the us camp, that doesn't mean it's a good thing. So, you know, we got to look out for the divisions implicit in a model like this. Any kind of us versus them binary is going to leave people out. And we got to be sensitive to that. The only person who benefits from this kind of thing is the status quo, is the white supremacist status quo. because it just divides minorities against each other so that they aren't able to join up and fight to change things. So next slide, please. So here's just a grab bag of JPEGs of Japanese Americans who don't really fit into the molds prescribed for them. There's Fred Korematsu, who fought against internment. There's Yuri Kochiyama, who was active in the civil rights movement. And then that's Suited for Solidarity. So our shtick is that from our history, we try and draw a message of solidarity. So we look to Japanese American history not as a thing where like we're trying to be part of the us group or anything like that. It's we're trying to just get rid of that binary altogether. So only when we learn to identify and reject narratives that uphold corrupt institutions and outdated hierarchies can we really be free to fight for the things we believe in. So our goal this morning is to get y'all to ask yourselves, who do I see as us and who do I see as them? Who do I see as the enemy? Who do I see as dangerous? And what stories have I been told that make me believe these things so deeply? Because whether or not we realize it, we are all subconsciously carrying around myths that hold us back. Myths that say the world is us versus them, or that the problems that other groups face don't affect us. And when we buy into those myths that pit us against each other, we uphold the status quo. So if you want to challenge the status quo, if you want to change things in the world today, liberation starts in your own mind. And you got to forget what you've been taught about who you are and about who other people are. You have to choose your stories carefully. So we got to choose today not to believe in division, but in a shared struggle for dignity. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a pretty neat quote, which basically what I put in bold is kind of hard to see, but dominant narratives celebrate or absolve groups who already hold power and blame those who are marginalized. So that's the power dynamic that's at play in these narratives, right? It's always like the people who are suffering deserve it, and the people who are empowered deserve that power. And we just got to find the myths that we believe in that uphold these ideas and get rid of them. So yeah, I'm going to pass it back to Casey.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve. Next slide, please. So yeah, after we've kind of gone over this very high overview of what narratives are and why we may need to challenge them sometimes, we would like to break us up into breakout rooms to have a little bit of a deeper discussion about what maybe a narrative that we previously had, have we challenged it for and later rejected, or if you ever had an aha moment. And when we say aha moment, I think of my time in college when I started taking ethnic study classes and realizing that the history I was taught in high school was only one side of the story, right? So that's an example of my aha moment. And then after this kind of overview reflection, we would like us to dig deeper and maybe conceptualize what are harmful narratives about J incarceration or harmful narratives about other social movements that we're involved in. And so we'll break us up into a 10-minute breakout group. And I'll put these questions, oh, someone did, thank you, in the chat. And so feel free to answer one of them, answer them all. You do not have to cover each and every one, but just to get us thinking. And so with that, we'll open up the breakout rooms. Yeah, is there anything else anyone else to add? If not, that's a great point to lead off from. I like your conception of making a new narrative, and think on that sense, if anyone else wants to share their aha moments or anything else they learned in the breakout room, feel free to put that in the chat. But if we could have our slides go back up. Thanks, Dan. Next slide. So yeah, so now after this kind of introspection on a personal individual level into kind of questioning how many narratives we hold within ourselves, how do we come to disrupt these dominant narratives? And so in the next sections, we'll be going over some activities and some strategies for doing this. And with that, I'll pass it to Lauren.
Thanks, Casey. Next slide, please. Actually, first, I just have to say, it's so nice to be in this Zoom with everyone. Like, I'm catching up on the chat and what everyone is sharing. It's just, it's really nice to share space with you all today. So just have to get that little moment of appreciation out there. I wanted to bring us back to starting with the self and how we engage with others. And just to start us off, this is a quote that I have found really grounding. And I just appreciate this definition of safety from Carla Mendoza, who's a New York City-based organizer, activist, and trainer. And the quote is, "Safety is when the conditions are such where you can feel that you can be your authentic self." So as we went through in the first section with Casey and Steve, when we're immersed in these like very harmful dominant narratives that uphold power dynamics that kind of suppress us and also condition us to buy into those dominant narratives that uphold these power dynamics, that really does bar us from showing up as our authentic selves. And so I wanted to turn back to our community agreements to talk through a bit more of what are some of the building blocks to creating that sense of safety, that space for us to show up as our full and authentic selves in every day and in organizing, with a caveat that I think in my workspace, I'm a social worker, there's this idea that we actually can't create a safe space. There's no such thing as a safe space, but you can work together and on ourselves to create safer spaces. So kind of that qualifier that when we acknowledge that safety, 100% safe space isn't really always possible, we can make room to unpack more of what are the barriers to safety. Next slide, please. Thank you. So kind of reverse engineering our community agreements from the beginning, I wanted to start off with, you're welcome to answer in the chat, just some questions to guide how we think of community agreements. So what qualities do you need in order to feel heard and respected? Qualities in a space, in a group, in any context that you can think of where you might be collaborating or having to be in community with others. And then also, what do you need to let go of in order to be present? And maybe an additional question to that last point, just a kind of self-check-in of how present are you right now on a scale of 1 to 10, just for yourself. What's running through your head? We're asking you to download a lot of information and frameworks today. So I can appreciate that. There's a lot floating in the air. But these are just questions I like to hold up for how we approach a space. So any qualities that come up for folks, if we could go back just for a second. Characteristics of a space that are important for feeling that sense of safety to show up as our authentic selves. Feel free to keep thinking and brainstorming, throwing any ideas in the chat. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, letting go of the idea of fear of the other and stigma, that us versus them binary, feeling like there's a impenetrable barrier between different groups. Fear of failure. Yes, definitely. That instead of making a mistake or failing in something, we are mistakes or we are failures. That's that can get conflated and really intense. Yes, having more time without interruption to feel respected. Thank you. These are great. Thank you so much. Yeah, understanding your own privilege in its space is a big one. And that, yes, it's okay to change your mind. Nikki, I love that. Mistakes are sometimes pathways to growth. Absolutely. Every experience is a learning experience, something I try to console myself with sometimes. So here we have, just to return to our the community agreements we started out with, and just to do a deeper dive into them, we have take space, mixed space, collaborative learning, practicing tenderness, confidentiality, taking care of ourselves to take care of each other. And these might be familiar. You might have, I think they're getting more standardized in different Zoom or like different organizing and workshop spaces. Just to kind of do a closer read, if we can go to the next slide. We live in systems that really discourage space for these practices of collaborative learning and taking care of ourselves, practicing tenderness within these power structures of white supremacy that are so deeply ingrained that it can be really hard to identify them, much less uproot them. And these, again, these dominant narratives that we kind of don't really question or until we get that aha moment or that dialogue with one another. So there's power in naming the aspects that we're all immersed in, whether they're internalized or showing up in spaces we work and organize in. And so if you're familiar with Tama Okun's writing on white supremacy culture, I just wanted to quickly draw a line from some of these community agreements, and absolutely what you all are sharing in the chat speaks directly to those as well, that these community agreements can be antidotes to combating characteristics of white supremacy culture. And if Tama Okun's work is new to you, no worries at all. We'll be sharing out some resources for more learning after the workshop today. But just to give an example of a characteristic of white supremacy that Tama Okun identifies is defensiveness and having a reluctance or an inability to receive criticism of new ideas, or like having resistance to change of existing power dynamics, and energy then goes into avoiding getting feelings hurt, avoiding conflict. And perfectionism is another example that we have to. So I threw into the expansion here just that in being mindful of how we're participating, we embrace imperfect language and stumbling through ideas because we can't be perfectly articulate all the time, and we're all showing up the best that we can be, and that's one of the commitments of these community agreements, that we're accepting how we're showing up, we're embracing discomfort, and if we experience judgment, that's a point to respond with curiosity. And I just lost my train of thought, but you, just to, I know I'm blazing through some very extensive concepts of white supremacy culture, but just to give like a preface to that. And I think there's, whether it's new to you or something you're returning to, they're just such useful frameworks for engaging with how different power dynamics can show up for us. But also to the point of like collaborative learning and being students of this work, I'll just add that applies to the resources I'm offering here as well. If these agreements don't quite resonate or there's other agreements that you would like to add, that just goes back to our questions of what we need to feel present and what you need to feel heard and respected. And so just again, I really appreciate what folks have shared in the chat. And tenderness, I'll just shout out, I think that sometimes I get resistance from that it's mushy to try to be open and acknowledge that spaces can be vulnerable in how we share our stories. And so in the spirit of the taking care of ourselves to take care of others and take care of each other, I just wanted to close with an invitation to having a quick 5-minute break before we go into our final section. So please take some time to stretch or drink some water, maybe a cup of tea, whatever you need to rest.
Oh, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, break will come later, but we
Oh my
just have
gosh.
a little bit more. It's okay,
Got it.
Lauren, until our next break. But actually, if we could go to the next slide. So yeah, so thank you so much, Lauren, for laying out those community agreements for us. I think, as you said, they're very important in helping us collaborate and be in community with each other. And I think that a very important part of this showing up and participating in a discussion or being a part of a conversation is being a listener. And so we have a quote that we'd like to share with you all by Paul Browd, and I'll read it off. Simply, when people are faced with open and non-judgmental listening, they are able to say who they really are in the world. They're able to express themselves fully, and what that brings is freedom. All right. So I want us all to just sit with that for a moment and just really take in the power of listening to a conversation and to activism and being able to express yourself and who you are freely. And abolitionist organizing, listening to each other and other voices non-judgmentally is important to understanding experiences we may not have had ourselves or narratives that we don't completely understand. And so next slide. So part of listening is being able to be empathic and being able to have sympathy and understanding of other individuals, right? And so what does empathic listening look like? Well, it looks like bringing compassion and respect to all conversations. It looks like listening with your full body and caring for presence. And it also looks like listening for feelings and needs and not to necessarily solve problems or advise, console. And so I invite anyone else who has any, I guess, strategies or practices for being able to be an empathic listener to share those in the chat with us, whether it be, any experiences you've had directly in the past or just ways you like to carry yourself within a conversation. What are ways that you practice empathic listening? And I see Beth said, putting away distractions. That's very true. Not looking at your cell phone. Zara says, listening to understand, not to react or respond. Yeah, that's a good one. Maria says, while listening, remember your needs. You can give your genuine self as a listener, but hold them internally to provide space. Very well said. Yes. Lizzie says, ask if the person I'm talking to wants someone to listen or someone to brainstorm. That's a great point too, thinking about your role in a conversation. Is it just to be a backboard or is it to have an opinion? Claire says, trying not to make assumptions about, oh my gosh, the scroll, about what various experiences mean to other people. Yes, thank you so much everyone for all these thoughts. Next slide, please. Please continue sharing. So as we kind of center ourselves within this empathic listening practice, we would like to pose an activity to all of us. So we will be breaking up again into breakout rooms in groups of 3 or 4, and we will be in each group of 3 or 4, each person will rotate among two of the following roles: as a speaker, a listener, or an observer. And in the cases that there's 4 people, 2 people would be the observer. Okay, so there will be 2 12-minute rounds, and we will be posing a question for each round. Each person will be assigned a role as a speaker, listener, and observer. First, next slide, please. First, the speaker will share their reflections on the question. Then, for 4 minutes, then the listener will share what they heard from the speaker for 3 minutes. And then the observer will share what they noticed about the listener or about the conversation for 3 minutes. And after all that is done, everyone will debrief for 2 minutes. And so this will be kind of a 12-minute block, and then we'll let y'all know when to switch roles, and then we'll let y'all know when to switch rounds to the next round. And so I believe Lisa just sent a doc with all these directions on them. If you weren't able to recall what I just said, And so if there's no questions, we can break y'all out into the breakout rooms now.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. If we could have our slides back to the debrief slide. I was so excited to push everyone into self-care earlier for a break, but we'll do a quick debrief and then we'll have our 5-minute break just to realign everyone. I hope that you all had a chance to experiment with, explore different roles in your breakout groups, and just to quickly reflect, what were some key takeaways for us and how we might show up in other communities, and how might we enter into other communities. One slide back. And you can feel free to raise your hand, or if you want to throw some thoughts in the chat. Nikki, thank you. A biggest aha solidarity moment was when I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 2019. Thank you for sharing that. I invite you, if you feel comfortable to, not to put you on the spot. If there's more you want to share about what made that like the biggest aha moment in solidarity, or any other thoughts around how we show up in other communities, how we enter into other communities. Seeing more in the chat.
I mentioned this in the chat, but I guess I can go ahead and speak if we're doing speaking.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks, April.
Sure. How, the purpose of the interactionless space changes based on, you can have one person that is directly impacted and one person that is not. You can have both people or neither of the people. And as an observer in my group, I noticed that there was an intentional acknowledgement of whenever some sort of trauma could have been happening based on sharing and based on listening. And we just kind of talked about the importance of unpacking that and what that means for that interaction based on the dynamics there.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and tying into what Mike put in the chat to understanding the dynamics in the space, making space for the most disenfranchised voices first, kind of like that balancing act of we speak from our own experience, but also how are we making space for whose experiences and who's and being respectful, consistent, and directly most impacted folks first. Take a moment to see what other folks are putting in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. I'm not catching everything, but just want to shout out capturing and sharing what you heard and learned is a powerful responsibility. Yes, Leslie. Cultivating awareness about our own trauma history and how that can sometimes cause us to self-erase. Being aware of how deferential we might become, or how we diminish ourselves in that erasure. Thank you, Mike. Seem to be coming up for other folks too. Creating supports collectively with one another for neurodivergent folks to be able to actively listen, and how to create support for that. Thank you, Maria. There's time for a few more thoughts. Any other connections? Yeah, such a basic but essential piece, remembering how do we make our community conversations, interactions and engagements accessible just with language. Who are we excluding from our work if we don't have language liberation practices? Yes, absolutely. Tools to ground us, to create focus, ways to encourage and increase capacity for listening. And yeah, playfulness and laughter is what is needed. Yes, thank you, Nora. Great ingredient to our organizing work. Joy is an essential piece. There's, I love the quote, that we don't just have to point out our wounds, but also the medicine for our healing, and laughter and playfulness can be part of that. Thank you, Stan. Sharing of ourselves makes it easier for others to share with us, but again, finding that balance of exchange, checking what folks have capacity for. Thank you. Next slide. Just to plant some seeds, these are a lot of questions. We'll again be sending them out after, but just for further reflection, weighing, and maybe these are great like journaling or writing practices for sort of processing after this workshop or just in day-to-day challenges. What does cross-community solidarity mean to you? How do we hold more inclusive conversations and build these connections? And what are some practices that we've looked at today or that we have in other parts of our lives? How can we pool our collective knowledge and experiences to and resources to engage in cross-community solidarity? Oh, Jennifer, I missed your comment. How lovely it is to be listened to, and how the listener, and for the listener to listen for our benefit and not theirs, and how it helps us process. Yes, I should absolutely give credit to the Community Building Committee for these questions that were generated in drafting these up for us. And yeah, finding our common denominators, Beth, finding similarities in experience to strengthen solidarity. Thank you. So please feel free to keep writing and reflecting in the chat. It doesn't just cut off because we, Sherry, I think it's also important to acknowledge how solidarity work is also flawed. It can be ableist and exclusionary. Absolutely. And having collective brainstorming and dialogues and exchanges to and creating spaces where there's enough trust to speak to and point out where we have those shortcomings, where we need to do better, and create more space for moving toward inclusive spaces. Yes. Great. Organizing around relation to power and shared goals. Yes, thank you, April. Abolition. So I think, again, please feel free to keep writing, reflecting. We are going to now transition into a 5-minute break. Please feel free to take this time to take care of yourself, replenish however you would, however you need, hydrate, maybe do a stretch, shake it out. We had you in breakout rooms for a good long while, so whatever you need to feel more grounded again. So yes, until 35 past the hour based on your time zone. Thanks, Lisa. And thank you everyone who shared and for continuing to think through and share as we go.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'll give folks 1 minute if you can hear me, but you're not at your computer yet, to make your way back to your computer. And while folks are coming back, in the next section, we're going to talk about something called public narrative. So I just put a link in the chat to a document that talks a little bit more about public narrative. It was also sent out by email before we got started. And we'll send it out again amongst the resources that that we'll share after this is over. So I'm going to just start by actually giving you 3 minutes to look over the second and third page of that document. Thanks, Stan. That's amazing. Yeah, perfect. So if you could just take 3 minutes to look over this page that Stan's got up on the screen, and then the second page. And maybe, Stan, do you mind if we just leave this up for about 1.5 minutes, and then I'll prompt you to scroll to the second page. But if you want to look through it on your own pace, feel free to take a look at the link in the chat. Thanks, Stan. If you don't mind scrolling to the next page, that would be great. You just mind scrolling to the bottom of the page, and then people can also come back to this if you're having a hard time following along right now. Thanks. Thank you so much, Stan. If we could go back to the slideshow. So far we've, talked a little bit at the beginning about some of the possible challenges of narratives that we've grown up listening to. Then we had time practicing empathetic listening and sort of the process of listening to each other and hearing stories. And now we're going to sort of move into a final section that looks at how do we craft new stories or different kinds of stories about particularly the Japanese American community, because that's a lot of who's here today, but it really could be about a whole range of communities or identities or issues. So if we could go ahead, maybe 2 slides. So in the public narrative document that either you just read or you'll read after this, Marshall Gans describes public narrative as an exercise of leadership by motivating others to join you in action on behalf of a shared purpose. So really, it's about sort of galvanizing people with the process of storytelling and of narrative creation. And if we could go to the next slide, here the focus is on stories. And I think that there's a lot to be said about this very powerful role that personal narrative can play. So just again, drawing from the handout, why stories? Because stories speak the language of emotion, the language of the heart. They teach us not only how we ought to act, but can inspire us with the courage to act. And because the sources of emotion on which they draw are in our values, our stories can help us translate our values into action. So if we could go into the next slide, Gans also offers a very specific model. This is not the only model, but this is just the model we're going to sort of talk through today about how we might tell stories that help turn that empathetic listening into action. And so in this model, there are sort of 3 parts. There's what are being called stories of self, stories of now, and stories of us. So stories of self may be rooted, in this case, in your family's experience of incarceration or the Japanese American community history of incarceration. A story of now would help you make the connection between the past and the present, or an issue that you're currently very passionate about. And a story of us is that call to solidarity, the call to action that you're trying to make. So we'll sort of go through each of these a little bit more with just some questions that are being offered as to how to help you think about crafting these stories. And then we'll also look at an example before giving you some time to think through your own story of self, story of now, and story of us. So if we could go to the next slide. As you think about a story of self, I think a lot about, what makes something like a movie or a TV show or a novel really compelling. It's that there are often characters that you really relate to, or individual people who draw you in. And I think that's what the story of self is doing. It's trying to humanize the narrative to try to draw somebody in. So as you think about writing a story of self, questions you might consider are, what are the sources of your own calling? What critical choice points or decisions do you remember making? And what kinds of stories can you tell about those decisions? And we'll come back, this is a lot of information, so we'll come back to this before you craft your own. But from stories of self, we'll move into stories of now, if we could go to the next slide. For stories of now, that's sort of making the transition from, maybe a past moment in your own life to the present moment. And as you think about a story of now, you might consider, what challenges are you facing, are the communities you're part of facing, that you want to call people on to act in the moment? What could you achieve if you could get a group of people mobilized around that action? And what specific action? Is it a call? Is it a letter? Is it a demonstration? Are you asking people to join you in? So sort of helping think through that transition from, a personal story into an urgent moment in the present. And then we'll sort of move to the last section, which is stories of us. If we could go to the next slide, thanks. And finally, moving sort of from the individual story to a present moment to a more outward sort of sense of community building, a building of an us. And as you're thinking about sort of building this us, who is that us? Who are you trying to reach out to? And as you think about those people, what do you think would motivate them to sort of join into your story? Are there experiences that you've shared? Are there values that you share? And so being able to sort of name those explicitly will help to build that collective us. So I know that was a lot of information. I will repost the link again, and again, you'll get it in email after this. But now I'm going to hand it over to Carl to talk through a specific example.
All right, thanks. Can we go to the next slide? So in the chat, I'm going to put in a link to a piece that I wrote several years ago. And just two disclaimers. One, I wrote this in my ACLU capacity. I'm not speaking in my ACLU capacity now. This, I'm doing this whole session in sort of in my personal capacity and in my pseudo capacity. Just want to make sure that those things are made clear. And the other thing about this is, like I said, I wrote it several years ago. I think that there are things that I would probably write differently about it now, given where I am on my abolitionist journey. But we're using this because of the way that it's so structured around this public narrative structure. So as you go through, and feel free to write about this in the chat. We'll also be talking about this in a few minutes. Think about, the parts in this piece where I am writing my story of self, where I am writing the story of now, and where I am writing a story of us. So I think now, can we go back to the slideshow? Next slide, please. And so I think let's walk through, next slide, please, the structure of this, and we can think about some of these questions that are being posed here. And the first part is the story of self. This is, telling the story of my grandfather, and, of me receiving these stories as a child, and then making the choice based on, knowing these stories, about what I wanted to do with my life. This again, it's sort of like, what are the sources of your calling? What are critical choice points you can recall? And what stories can you tell about these choice points? That, these are the questions that this part is trying to answer. And it sort of gives context to what comes next. Next slide, please. And that is the story of now, about mass incarceration, immigration enforcement, and detention and deportation. Making clear that this is not just a story about my personal experience or the Japanese American experience, but sort of relating this to what is going on now and the urgency of all of these forms of incarceration that are occurring at a mass scale today, and sort of posing the challenge that then sort of really get into in the story of us and how that relates to our values. Next slide, please. And that's the final part about asking like what America stands for based on this. And this is a day of remembrance piece. So it's the call to action is really about just sort of thinking about values. But there are ways in which when we're talking about the story of now and the story of us, we can have a much sharper focus on doing something specific. And I think that, the other thing that's important to look at here is that it's a story of us, not a story of me, a story of you. So like the language here is very much like we, us, our, because, what the story of us is trying to do is to like identify the values that are driving us, and also sort of, put the speaker and the audience together as part of a broader community, and not, try and sort of build these walls between us. Next slide, please. So we're going to do an exercise next where you, build your own public narrative. And the first step is to identify what the story of now that you're going to be talking about, because that shapes how you're going to frame the story of self. What particular stories from your experience you're going to use as part of that narrative, and how you frame the story of us. So some of the examples, Vision Act and Lumley, this is one of the campaigns that Sudo has been very active on. Lisa has a document linked in the chat that can help brainstorm, that sort of, like helps you think in terms of these three categories, and how the three stories build your narrative. HR 40 and reparations is another. Racial disparities in police stops, arrests, incarceration is another. Child detention is another. And all of these are things where, it's sort of, you think about first identify the story of now, then think about the story of self that is rooted in Japanese American identity. And, again, thinking about like what, the sources of your calling, and then build the story of us that, sort of identifies those values. Who is the us that you're calling upon to join in this fight? And what shared experiences do we have when you're thinking about the us of you and your audience together? So we'll spend 10 minutes thinking about this. Right now it's 53 minutes before the hour, so it'll be 3 minutes after the hour. And after we spend 10 minutes doing that drafting, we'll then go and pair up in breakout rooms and practice telling our narratives to each other. So yeah, thank you, everyone. I think, part of this discussion helps show how, these, the use of public narrative in these tools, it's like, it really helps unearth some really powerful, deeply personal stories that we're able to use. And we can actually pull down the slides for now and then come back to that later. So that, these really powerful, deeply personal stories. And I just want to bring it back to the beginning where, we talked about the importance of breaking down these dominant, harmful narratives. And so one of the things that, we do is each of us, continue working on, the public narratives that we're going to use and that we're going to speak about, is to make sure that we're not reinforcing those harmful narratives in the way that we, put forward our goals and our values. A couple examples come to mind. One, Lumley, the campaign, this is something where the immediate narrow goal was to get the governor to issue a pardon that would remove the sort of immediate danger of deportation from, Lumley's case. And the arguments that had to be made to the governor in order to, get that pardon are, arguments that are sort of rooted in an entire framework that's very carceral and problematic in a lot of ways. And so, the way that we should be, talking about, the Lomley's case and the sort of the larger context that it fits into of, what safety and security in this country means, and like, the divisions between who's considered deserving of that safety and security and who's considered undeserving. We really want to think deeply about how we talk about that, especially when we're connecting this to our own personal experiences. Because, when we are putting our personal experiences out there, as part of this effort to, like achieve a particular goal, we want to make sure that we're staying true to our long-term values, even if in some cases, the audience is, for a specific action is the governor and is going to be bound up in these other narratives that, are problematic. And I think that the other thing to keep in mind is all of this work on making public narratives is one where you can and should keep refining it. That's, you can have something that you write that, like, what I wrote in 2014, that you can revisit it and think, maybe there are ways that I can do this differently. And there is nothing wrong with that. And in fact, it's really good to just, keep like working on it and workshopping it. So now I think I'm going to hand it back to Lisa, and we can go back to the slideshow there. I think it's one of the last slides to close everything out.
Thanks, Stan. If we could maybe go to the Get Involved slide, and I'll actually hand it over to Casey, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thank you, Carl. So yeah, this would kind of conclude our workshop today. Thank you, everyone, for logging on. We would also like to provide the opportunity and to get involved with Sudo. We have many different working groups and committees, and I did not do them justice by listing them all on the slide. So you can go ahead and visit that link on the slide there, sudoforsolidarity.org/get involved, and it should take you to a Google form. And yeah, you can come organize with us in whatever capacity you have. We also have several different regional hubs if you would like to get connected with them. Let's see. And yeah, and this one was organized by the Police, Prisons, and Detention Working Group. And so if you're specifically involved in this working group, we welcome anyone with any organizing experience. And you can switch to the next slide. And yeah, follow us on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. We are on the socials, and also there's our Gmail and website. And yeah, thank you all to all the co-organizers for organizing, and as well as all of you participants for being here. This is truly a very great workshop, and I appreciate everything that everyone shared. And I love doing this at the end of workshops. On the count of 3, can everyone unmute and just say like a word of appreciation or a clap or anything they would like to say to appreciate the space? I will count off and everyone unmute. Right, ready? 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks, everyone.